Nathaniel Lee is who you want by your side in the courtroom. You've seen the rest, now hire the best. Contact Lee, Cosell, and Feigley today. And now, to address the legal concerns of the community, Praise 1810, 95.1 FM presents Legally Speaking. Here are today's hosts.
Good morning, everyone. This is Nathaniel Lee. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for listening to our show and broadcasting our show to your friends and your neighbors, and also the well wishes I see out and about at Kroger and places like that. Thank you for the comments. Today we have our superstar panel again. There's some important issues upcoming election. We have Attorney Milton and Attorney Vanita Bank. And then the third special guest, we have Attorney Marlon Primes. He's a longtime Justice Department, retired, of course, but to provide some helpful insights into legal issues that are paramount, that are going around us, and apparently sometimes they go unnoticed. So we'll start off today. Good morning, Counselor. How's everybody doing today?
Morning, Mr. Lee.
Very well, very well.
Good
Attorney
morning.
Banks. Well, we'll start off first with Attorney Primes. You worked at the Justice Department. You had a private practice now. This January 6th insurrection, did you have any personal knowledge of that? Did you have any family members involved in that melee?
Yes, I mean, this has a great personal significance for myself for a number of reasons. Many of us dread ever getting phone calls repeatedly from a loved one. We always know that that's a sign that there's an emergency. So I had a deposition on January 6th and didn't really think much of it. And then I saw that my wife had called multiple times. And so I took a break, obviously, and she says, "Are you watching the news?" I'm like, no, I'm in a deposition. And then she explained to me that the Capitol had just been taken over, and there are these mobs of people. And our concern is at that time my daughter was working in Congress. She worked on the House side, then she worked on the Senate side. And so we could not find her. We did not know if she was barricaded in her office. Because the one thing that has not been widely publicized is that when the Secret Service came and evacuated the Congress people, such as Nancy Pelosi and the leadership that were in the old building, they pretty much left the staff to fend for themselves. So these are folks that are in their early 20s that aren't making a lot of money. Meanwhile, you have throngs of people pounding on the door that they want to hang and kill and lynch them. So luckily, we were able to locate our daughter. She was not at work that day. She did live right next to the Capitol. So she had to kind of deal with some of the crowds and things of that sort, people knocking on the first floor of her apartment building. So it was a pretty harrowing experience. So personally for me, when I hear people talk about, hey, it's insignificant, it just doesn't ring true to me. And not only from the personal perspective of my daughters, just the issue of the rule of law and having the civil democracy being ransacked and people not taking that seriously. So it's very unnerving.
Well, the second issue, though, is that this has resulted in protracted litigation. And Attorney Banks had talked about this on our prior shows, and Attorney Grimes, and we've talked about it several times. But what happened this week, the Supreme Court appears to be doing legal gymnastics or jujitsu, whatever they're doing. In this case, going back and forth. What we saw in our own eyes was clear criminality. And somehow it appears that it's been the facts, the evidence look like it's been changed in terms of peripherally. And so now we got this brief filed by Jack Smith this week. What can you tell us about that, and why is that important?
You made a weigh in on that, or?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's very important because first of all, I think we have to kind of talk a little bit about the timeline. The Supreme Court basically indicated that there needed to be a detailed factual analysis as to whether or not, President Trump, as it relates to the allegation, the indictment, they had to specify whether or not those are official conduct, acting in his official capacity as a president, or in a private capacity. And the determination is that if it's an official capacity, in so many words, that this is what we hired him to do. These are part of your duties, that you're going to be immune. Whereas if you're working in a personal capacity, then those are the areas that he can be indicted. So in response to the Supreme Court decision, the special prosecutor, Jack Smith, basically followed the Supreme Court's instructions. There was they presented the case again in front of the grand jury, and they followed the specifications of the Supreme Court. And this particular filing is in response to say, hey, these are the acts that are official, and these are the acts that are in his personal capacity that are subject to indictment. So that's what the 165-page pleading is about. There's some redactions, and of course, the former president's team will get an opportunity to file a response. But this is something that will be in litigation, my prediction, for quite some time, because after those determinations are made, then there'll be a right of appeal, and it may go back and forth for some time.
Frank Grimes had some really good comments because he was concerned about the timing of this. Attorney Grimes?
Well, I was hoping that Brother Malone would speak on the difference in the personal and the official capacity, and whether or not that would affect any timing here with filing this matter, or is it relevant? I mean, what's your opinion about that?
Well, this is really frustrating for former government employees, because we're specifically trained, and I was a federal government employee for 30 years before I retired, and now I'm in private practice. But it was drilled in your head that you have to follow the law, you have to follow ethics rules, and if you are outside of those rules, then you're on your own. If there's a lawsuit, then you're going to have to get your own attorney to handle that. So it's just unnerving, in terms of how things are proceeding, where it appears that someone is abusing their authority. Now you have to look at that in the context of there's so many federal employees that have been fired for jobs because whether it might be sexual harassment, whether it might be a tort or any other area of the law where it's determined they were not in the scope of their employment, and they either lost their job, they had to pay for their own representation. And it seems as though the Supreme Court is almost ignoring a lot of that well-settled precedent. So I was very surprised that the DC Court of Appeals case was not affirmed, and that there was a writ of certiorari granted. I was very surprised regarding the oral argument, where it really didn't go into the facts as much as I would have thought. And there just doesn't seem to be consistent with long established precedent as it relates to in the scope of your employment, outside the scope of employment, official and not official. And I can kind of talk a little bit more detail, about some of the aspects of that that are really unnerving.
Could it, Nate, please?
But yeah, okay. So if you look at this, I mean, some of the things that are very, very troubling are the president of the United States has great power and authority on a lot of different areas. All right, and so for the president, he has a legal team. Outstanding legal staff. He has the U.S. Department of Justice that he can get legal advice. A number of the people at Department of Justice are career employees. They have specialization in various areas. You can get their advice. So what the president did is that instead of relying upon that advice, he got his own attorneys, private attorneys, to take action that, at least a number of us believe is not consistent with applicable law in terms of what he did. And so the legal question is that if this truly was in the scope of your employment, this was if your allegation rings true that this is an official act, then why didn't you use the Department of Justice or the White House counsel? Why did you rely upon, Rudolph Giuliani, John Eastman, other people that were private attorneys that had outlier opinions that were different than what you had been, told by your own hired staff and also DOJ? So there are just a number of different things that just don't make a lot of sense in terms of the arguments that have been put forth. But to a lot of our dismay, the Supreme Court took a very wide view. I think the view of most people that I talked to was that the DC Court of Appeals and the district court got it right, and that seemed to be consistent with applicable law. And it just seems as though the Supreme Court is kind of going beyond that. So it's going to be interesting to see, now that Jack Smith has put forth this brief, 165 pages that are very compelling, that really explain in detail why he believes the president was acting in his personal capacity. Because one of the things you have to understand, when you are running for office and you are a candidate for office, you're not in your official capacity. So what Jack Smith is trying to demonstrate is that all the activities that were taken were in that capacity as a candidate. Right. You don't have a role as it relates to January 6th. Vice President Pence, as the president of the Senate, all his role is to open up the electoral votes and read it. It doesn't set forth a role for the president. So what Jack Smith is saying is that since there is no role, the president was acting in the capacity of a president, of a candidate rather, and therefore there should not be immunity, especially when you've gotten a lot of advice to indicate what a lot of us thought was obvious, that one person, that being, the vice president at that time, Vice President Pence, did not have the constitutional authority to throw out, properly certified votes from the Electoral College. And you had a president basically telling him to do so. So those are the issues that are going to be, among other issues, are going to be litigated. And my prediction is that they'll be litigated for some time to come.
How do you address the issue regarding the timing of it, though, the interference with the election process?
Well, I think, you have to kind of look at the whole timeline. Jack Smith, as many of you may recall, he basically asked for an expedited review, months ago, that this case would go to the Supreme Court as opposed to the DC Court of Appeals. So the special prosecutor basically tried to say, hey, there's an election coming up. Let's get this decided sooner rather than later. So I think it would be a hard argument, at least in my view, if you look at the totality of circumstances, to suggest that there's politics at play, because you have Jack Smith basically saying, hey, let's expedite this process. So the decision that came out in June, he was asking for that decision to have happened in April or May, and there could have been a determination as to whether the president is immune or not, and these issues could have been resolved. The second point that's really important is to note that after the Supreme Court decided the case, again, at the very end of its docket, I mean, we're only talking June, the DC trial court judge, Judge Chutkan, had to respond to that and put a trial schedule. And all the special prosecutor is doing is responding to the instructions of the Supreme Court and putting forth, hey, here is my evidence. There's been a new indictment. Here's why I believe that these acts are not official acts, which would mean there would be an immunity from prosecution. These are private acts because, for the reasons I indicated, number one, you didn't use, DOJ or White House staff. You used private attorneys, and it was outlier opinions. You had 60 some odd cases that were filed by this private group of attorneys, and they lost all the cases. So it's a very, very hard argument to make, at least in my view, that somehow this is election interference. If you look at the totality of circumstances, if you look at the clear timeline, in my view.
And this is the first time that the Supreme Court, going back to the Supreme Court 6-3 decision in Trump versus the United States, this is the first time that the Supreme Court has considered a case involving the criminal prosecution of a former president for alleged official acts. And they grounded their decision in separation of powers principles. They asserted guided their decision in the case. And so while they held that there's no immunity for unofficial acts, they, as Marlon stated, remanded the case back to the trial court for determination as to what acts might be official and what acts may be unofficial. And in a scathing dissent in the case, which Justice Sotomayor read aloud from the bench, she stated that the majority, they endorsed this expanded vision of presidential immunity that was never recognized by the founders, any sitting president, the executive branch, or even President Trump's own lawyers, because during the oral arguments, they argued that a president, or they conceded that a president would not be immune for all of his actions. And Marlon, you've so expertly pointed out that this is a distinction between the president operating within his official core duties and responsibilities that are laid out in the Constitution. We know in the Nixon case, which addressed the issue of immunity many, many years ago, they talked about acts within the quote perimeter. They might have been close to being outside of the official, act. So they talked about that, as well. But Justice Sotomayor was very concerned, and she pointed out that never in the history has a president even had an expectation that he would be immune from criminal prosecution if he used his office to violate the criminal law. And so she ended her dissent with these words: "With fear for our democracy, I dissent." And she also shared some very troubling hypotheticals. For example, if a president decided to assassinate his opponent, would that be considered to be an official act or within the realm of his constitutional authority? Or if he took a bribe in order to grant a pardon, for example. And so this case really shocks the conscience. But where we are now, with the case having been remanded, Jack Smith goes back and prepares this over 150-page indictment, which lays out methodically the acts of the president that were not within the core of his constitutional authority, and that he is acting as a candidate as opposed to the presidency.
I guess I'm a little confused as to what this interference means. Does it mean, Marlon and Vanita, Nate, that there's a sort of a decease, a fire time during the election period, 90 days or 6 months before, that there's a truce, that we don't attack or we don't get into the things that we're into now because it interferes with the public approach to the election somehow?
Well, I can speak to that. I think we're looking at two different things. All right. So in terms of the U.S. Department of Justice, their policy has been for some time that, hey, they have to be viewed as calling balls and strikes and not partisan and not trying to be involved in the electoral process. So as a consequence, there is a DOJ guidance indicating that in terms of bringing indictments, in terms of bringing prosecutions near a time of an election, that is not in the best interest of DOJ or the public. So as a consequence, typically you're not going to see any DOJ action as it relates to a sitting candidate, within a particular period of time prior to an election, 60, 90 days out. This is a little bit, I think, a lot different in that the indictment, was issued some time ago. It went through the trial court, the Court of Appeals, and also went to the United States Supreme Court. And so what's being done right now is just following the edict of the U.S. Supreme Court to have a fact-specific analysis as to whether or not something is in the official acts or duties or responsibilities of the president versus not official. And so I don't think there's anything that violates that principle by having the parties flesh that out. And again, I think the important thing to remember is that Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, who was hired because they didn't want the inference of someone that the president had appointed to be involved in this process. He tried to expedite this so that it would happen in the spring as opposed to the fall. So I think we have to be careful that it's a DOJ policy. It typically talks about like a prosecution, things of that sort. And that's not happening, and that there were steps that were taken by the special prosecutor so that these things would not be happening in the fall.
I got a question to everybody, and this bothered me. Based on what you're saying, Marlon, about the time limit, we saw an indictment of the mayor of the largest city in America, of New York City, Mayor Adams, and that we have a critical congressional election going on in the state of New York, and that will determine the outcome of who controls the House of Representatives. Why was it okay for Damon Williams to file an indictment against Mayor of New York within that 3-month time window when he's been investigating for 3 years? What would have been the difference in him filing the freaking indictment November 12th? Why did he file that indictment before the election? I think that's incongruent with what I hear to be the Justice Department policy, in view of the fact that I assume that an indictment like that would go all the way up to the chain of command to the AG Garland. And so I was troubled by that indictment, the timing of that indictment. And so they're giving kid gloves to some of the Trump people, but I didn't like the idea of this indictment being filed at that time.
Yeah, I was surprised by that because, as I said before, typically, it's not done, near the time of the election. Now, I don't know if the U.S. attorney was looking at it from the context of this candidate, this individual who's indicted being a candidate himself. Maybe that's how he was looking at it, and saying that since, the mayor of New York was not a candidate for office, that he felt that issuing the indictment, prior to the election was appropriate. So, that's something that he would have to, explain in detail. But I can just tell you there is some sensitivity, especially at the Department of Justice, especially given the history in terms of things that had been done in the past. You're talking about J. Edgar Hoover, Martin Luther King. As a result of that, there's more sensitivity to make sure they're not doing anything to impact an election. So I get your point that this could, even though Mayor Adams is not a candidate, it could impact other races. And I think that's a fair point to be made. And I think it also is a fair point to say that, hey, what was the sense of urgency in terms of doing it, prior to the election as opposed to after? The only thing I can think about is that there's been a lot of criticism of DOJ regarding, politics. And I don't know if this was in response to that, to say, hey, we're calling balls and strikes evenly, and therefore, we're going to show that, we can be just as tough on a Democrat. I don't know if that was the calculus or not. But I think you raise a fair point that this could have been brought after the election.
Those are all excellent points, Marlon. That are making me think too about the James Comey investigation of Hillary Clinton. Very close to that presidential election as well was somewhat troubling.
Yeah, and I agree. And it was, and as many people may know, that after the former FBI director James Comey, in that situation, your audience may recall that there was a FBI investigation of then candidate Hillary Clinton as relates to her emails, and so there was some new evidence that came out, and Comey made an announcement, right before the election, and that certainly had an impact. So the thing about that is that there was an investigation by the Inspector General, and they were very critical of in terms of what Comey did and how he did it. And there was an indication that you had a sitting candidate, and that candidate was up for election, and you put something out in the public sphere, and obviously that had some impact on the outcome. So I think the distinction I would suppose that DOJ would make and the Inspector General would make is that in terms of Hillary Clinton, she was the candidate. It was prior to the election, and I would advise the audience to look online in terms of the Inspector General's report, and it was very, very harshly critical of James Comey as a result of what he did. And I think in terms of Eric Adams, I think the argument is going to be made, well, hey, this person isn't sitting for office, but I think you can make the fair point, as Nathaniel has made, that this is still going to impact, other races, because New York City is such a huge, metropolis. It's going to impact the greater New York City area, which you're right, could have an impact on, who ultimately controls the House of Representatives and actually Congress.
The next issue regarding this matter is that in terms of the process, explain the process. So he files this brief that's very damning, that lays out a substantial amount of criminality, not just with Trump, but with other folks. It was just incredible to me. And they redacted out the names of the other participants. But the thing that's been consistent about the Trump cases is that lawyer after lawyer who filed these frivolous lawsuits, they've all been disciplined. Some have lost their license, most notably Giuliani in both DC and New York. And what was the name of the attorney who came up with it was a Wyco's theory about Venezuelan, I can't think of her name. They got hit with sanctions in different courts. And then there's still indictments after indictments and bar complaints all over the place. But in the middle of all this, the person who is the ringleader, it seemed like that they're doing everything possible to escape liability from him. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
It really doesn't, and I think it's very troublesome. And I just kind of go back to the point again. Look at attorney Bob Barr. This is somebody who is not a progressive by any stretch of the imagination. He is a conservative, and he served prior attorney general under the Bush administration and came back during the Trump administration. And, one of the reasons I believe that he got appointed is that he was very critical of a lot of the investigations as it relates to Russia regarding former President Trump. He was appointed. So the very important thing to note is that he testified that he informed the president that these allegations of voter fraud aren't viable. And you have to look at it in the context of the U.S. Attorney General has the resources of Interpol, the FBI, the intelligence apparatus, and for him to say point blank, hey, this is not factual, that's a very powerful statement. And I agree with you that, you know, in a client, after getting that information, searches for the opinion that suits their particular needs, does so at their peril. And I think the other point is that I want to raise, especially with, you know, younger attorneys and just attorneys in general, is that you have to really, you know, take this under advisement. That we've all had circumstances where a client may ask you to do something, and you have to look at how this is going to look later in time. These attorneys, John Eastman, Giuliani, they told Trump what he wanted to hear, even though it had no basis in law and fact. They made a number of very inflammatory statements relating to election workers that were just doing their job. And then, you know, Rudy Giuliani got hit with a defamation case that's basically going to, you know, crumble him financially, and rightfully so. So the point of the matter is, number one, the client should be very careful in shopping for an opinion of their choosing, because you do so at your peril. And also, finally, attorneys, you need to understand that you have to follow the rule of law, and that you might get a short-term gain in terms of, you know, having the president's eye, but it's not going to end well for you. And the flip side of that is not only did many of these attorneys lose their license, my prediction is, you know, if this case, you know, gets to a jury, and when it's ultimately tried, one of the key defenses of the president is going to be that I relied upon these attorneys. So these attorneys that led them down the garden path, not only do they lose their license, get sanctioned, but they're ultimately going to be blamed by the president, is my view.
I need to respond to some real quickly, and then I ask another question to Renee, who's been texting us. Renee, there's something very important. The House of Representatives this year, in the last election cycle, was determined by the Democratic seats lost in the state of New York. So there's about 5 or 6 critical seats in the state of New York, all near that New York metropolitan area, that could determine the outcome of the House of Representatives. So the point is that we see, like in the state of North Carolina, for example, we see Mark Robinson, the loose cannon running, the lieutenant governor, who said all kind of crazy things. His polling numbers are so bad until people now distance themselves away from him. So what happened is that could the one bad candidate result in other people being turned off by the political party? Of course it would. And we've seen that, for example, in Indiana, back when the Richard Nixon debacle occurred. Indiana went blue. Marion County, all the judges became Democrats because of Richard Nixon committing criminal offense at the White House. And so the adverse effect, or you could have contamination or cross-contamination by one candidate upon an entire political party. Now, the polar opposite of that, of course, is Trump. We got a person who's been adjudicated to be a sexual abuser, a woman in a department store. He openly bragged about doing certain things to women on TV camera. We have a person who's got judgments after judgment against him. He's been convicted of, well, civil fraud in New York. He can't own a business. And for whatever reason, he's not dragging the party down. So it's an outlier to what is normal in American political history. Going back to the Civil War, this is the first time in American history that we've seen a candidate so corrupt and so tainted that he has not brought down the entire political party. It's just an unusual turn in American history. Now, So where we are now is that, so he files his brief that lays out this David evidence. What happens next?
Well, the next step is going to be Trump's lawyers are going to get a chance to do a point-by-point rebuttal. And what they have done is they've asked the court for an extension of time so that their response will not be prior to the election. It will be after the election, which is telling. One of the things that they obviously could do if they're saying that, hey, there's election interferences is going to have an impact, given all the resources that have been put to bear for the legal expenses of the president. If they're truly concerned about adverse impact, you would think that they would try to have an extension so that there's a response prior to the election. But they decided not to do so, which is entirely their right. And so their response will be after the election. Then the next step in the process is that Judge Chutkan, who sits on the DC District Court, will then consider all the briefs. There very well may be an opportunity for a rebuttal of replies. And so that may go back and forth. And so, and then there's a possibility that the district court could have oral argument as it relates to the question of in the scope or outside the scope of their official court duties. And then there's a possibility, as we noted in the case regarding Mark Meadows, where there were similar issues. There was also a testimony that was, put forth for one side and then the other side. So after the briefing, there very well may be an opportunity for there to be a mini hearing where the individual witnesses, particularly, Mike Pence, Attorney General, Bob Barr, others may be able to testify that, hey, this is what I told the president. And then the president's lawyers would be able to put on a rebuttal case. My view is that the judge will then make a decision, and then it will go to the DC Court of Appeals and then perhaps back to the Supreme Court, and they'll make a determination as to whether or not these individuals' inquiry and decisions that Judge Chutkan has made, and then of course the DC Court of Appeals has made, whether they're consistent with what the Supreme Court views as the applicable law. So we very well may have a situation where it goes to the Supreme Court a second time and they say, aha, well, maybe they weren't careful enough, and they send it back again. That could very well happen as well. So my prediction is it's going to take some time to resolve these issues. And since it's an immunity, you get an appeal. So they're going to have to resolve those issues before they can try the case. So it may be years before this case actually gets tried.
Well, one final point was critical in this case is Trump loses the election. There's a good probability he's going to end up in prison on some of these cases, But having said that, Marlon, the 800-pound gorilla, you're in the state of Ohio, and what's been making the news is Springfield, Ohio.
Yes.
They're eating dogs, they're eating cats, they're eating your pets, these outright lies. How's that affected? You're in Ohio, you're in the middle of this.
Right.
I mean,
it's just really disconcerting, and I think it's just part of the breakdown of our society, and I think it's just kind of another example. I mean, you're having people that are just going about their daily lives, and now they have this unwanted attention. You have students that through no fault of their own can't go to school because there's all these as a result of these accusations that have been made that have no basis in fact. There's constant death threats, constant alarms. School has been in and out of session, so it has an adverse impact. And what's really troubling about it is that what has not been widely reported is that in terms of the Haitian immigrants, they are all in the United States legally under a program that was not enacted by a Democrat, but enacted by Trump, former President Trump. And the whole rationale there was that they did not have enough people, enough available workers. And obviously there was a crisis in Haiti, and there was a process that allowed them to go there to fill real jobs. And if you look at a lot of, some of the coverage, many of these employers have said, hey, our businesses would have shut down, but for these workers coming and filling these very needed jobs. So in answer to your question, it's had a very bad impact. And I think, one of the things that's just as disappointing is that, it's important to have shows like yours, Nathaniel, where you can really break down the facts, because there are so many people that believe, falsehood. Yeah,
Okay,
that
go
believes
ahead.
falsehoods. Right. Because, it's been shown that this is not accurate. It all started where someone said my pet is missing, and then come to find out, this individual says, no, the pet's not missing at all. And you've even had, statements from some of the candidates saying, well, hey, look, I was just trying to call attention to the larger issue of immigration. Well, hey, you have every right to argue that, you think immigration should be one way or another, but that doesn't justify, the misstatement, because you're adding a lot more problems to a community that is struggling. My wife grew up in Dayton, which is probably 20, 25 miles to the south of that. They're very good people, hardworking people. And you got to look at this community as like many communities around the country. They had a manufacturing base. A lot of that manufacturing base is left. They dealt with the opioid epidemic, and now they're trying to recover. And these remaining employers are just trying to stay in business and serve their community. And then you have someone just making up things that have no basis in law or facts, which is very, very disconcerting. So I hope there's more shows like yours, Nathaniel, that will give people an opportunity to say, well, hey, here's what the truth is. Here's the issues that are not happening, and here's the impact of that.
Marlon,
Go ahead, Attorney Banks, go ahead.
I wanted to ask Marlon about, because we talked about the Ohio tragic situation, deplorable situation with respect to those allegations, those false statements, as you stated, Marlon. The Haitian people, they are in this country legally, hardworking, and we talked about whether there could be any actions that could be filed. And I read that the Haitian Bridge Alliance has filed a lawsuit against President Trump and J.D. Vance regarding these false claims. And just wondering what your thoughts are regarding that litigation. They're seeking criminal charges.
Right. I mean, it's going to be a tough case to bring because it's not being brought by a local prosecutor. It's being brought by a private attorney. The law does allow that to take place, but we're going to have to see how that plays out. But it's not through the traditional means of having a local prosecutor be part of that litigation. So what I would look for, if the local prosecutor, joins it, that would certainly be interesting, and I think increase the chances of that being successful. But I think right now the litigation is going forward. It will be interesting as it relates to how the case progresses, because you do have a number of statements now that are part of the public record, that those that made these statements have in essence basically admitted that they're not true. And it can't be no doubt that this has had a disastrous impact on the finances of this small town. They're spending a lot more money for fire, for police, for these false alarms. There are individuals that are there that are hardworking, don't know if there are other people coming in the community that are going to harm them. So it's just very, very difficult situation. And I don't blame, those that file litigation for filing. I think they have certainly a legitimate basis, because there were statements that appear to be made that have no basis in law or fact. And, it's been shown that these have had an impact on people through no fault of their own. So it will be interesting to see what happens, but I think it's just not through the traditional route, which oftentimes makes it more difficult for these cases to be successful. But we'll just have to see if it's joined by the local prosecutor and where the case goes.
Thank you, Marlon.
Okay, we'll take a quick call from our caller. Caller, you have a question or comment for us today? Hello? You can unmute. Okay, we lost the caller. Okay, we'll go on. The other issue has to do with early voting. Early voting has started, I saw, in the state of Virginia, and it starts for all our listeners, I think, on Tuesday of this week in Indianapolis or Indiana. And I know that Attorney Banks was telling me earlier that early voting already started in Chicago.
Yes, actually, early voting started in the state of Illinois in some counties on September 26th. And that would be Lake County, Will County, and a couple other counties, DuPage, I believe, as well. And on this past Thursday, and I want to shout out to Rainbow Push. Rainbow Push hosted a motorcade from the Rainbow Push offices down to the elections office to, it was a early voting motorcade. It was police escorted from Rainbow Push down to the election office, where people were able to actually cast their early vote. And what we found on Thursday is that early voting had increased, and there were lines outside the door and around the corner, people wanting to early vote in Chicago on October 4th. So we're off to the races already here in the state of Illinois. And I mentioned on many occasions that we're a very progressive state and a model state as it relates to enabling every citizen to exercise their fundamental right to vote here in Illinois. You have a right to mail your ballot in, or to, of course, early vote all the way up to November 4th, which the national election is November 5th in many cases, as well as register on election day. Now, I don't recommend that you wait until election day to register, but you do have that option here in the state of Illinois.
Well, for the folks here in Indiana, you can go on the website today and check your registration. So Indiana residents, check your registration today. Not only will it tell you, it will tell you whether or not you're properly registered. Because if you live in an apartment, for example, and you change from one apartment unit to another one, you actually need to update your registration. You can do it on the internet. But more importantly, it also tells you everybody you can vote for. And so it's important that you do that, because I think registration ends on Monday and early voting in Indiana starts on Tuesday. And me and my family, we're going to vote early. Milton, what about California?
We can vote early, as Illinois has led the nation in showing, and we can vote and we can register on the date of the election. But can I just ask a question about this brief? Is there any feeling that this is going to affect Mr. Trump's run for the election, or it's just more fodder for them to argue about how he's being denied his rights?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. If we look at it from a historical perspective, there's a lot of voters that support the former president, that are appear to be of the view that I don't care, what has been said about him, that I'm going to vote for him anyway. And it's just like, the trials that all of us have been involved with. There are just some people you're not going to be able to turn. And, and they basically, shown that there's a core group of people that, irrespective of what has been said, that they're going to still vote for the president. And I think the problem is that you have a number of people that are low information voters, and they don't understand the factual issues. They don't go beyond the point that, hey, this is allegedly election interference, without understanding the timeline that I talked about in terms of the Jack Smith asking for an expedited appeal, the Supreme Court, having this the last case on their docket. So if you come from the perspective that you're not getting a lot of information from a variety of different sources, you could view this as someone picking on the president, and his core base may use this to support that narrative. And you have a number of networks that are out there, podcasts, that are using it in the same way. So I think that group of people are going to be, more excited and more apt to vote for the president. But it's really important for those that are persuadable to get all the facts, understand the facts, get that information from a variety of different sources, and make an informed decision.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to the line. Caller, you have a question or comment for us today, caller?
Yeah, hi. I actually have a comment. I thank you guys for the show. I really appreciate it, and all the issues that you talk about. I'm a New York City person. I live in New York City, and I wanted to comment on the New York City piece. I agree with you that there were 4 seats in New York that should not have been lost. And we lost them because the DNC didn't think we needed to spend money there, that there was a given that we were going to take those 4 seats. I think that this time around that the DNC realized that New York City is pivotal in order to take the House back. And so I think they're doing everything they can to make sure that we take the House back. And that's the other thing that I think we're beginning to talk about, not just the presidential, but we need to also make sure that people vote blue all the way down the ballot, because the House and the Senate is very important. I think we might keep the House, and I'm feeling pretty good about us I think we might keep the Senate, and I'm feeling pretty good about us getting the House back. So, it's all boots down. And this is going to turn on how many people actually get off their asses and go vote blue. It's not necessarily going to be, anything else but that. So that's my thoughts. And I thank all you attorneys for filling us in and making sure that we understand what the legalities are on these different issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, caller, for calling. And one of the issues that we're dealing with is that when I talk to some of my Republican friends, and in terms of voting, they say there's one common thing that's driving me crazy, Marlon and Milton and Vanita. They say, well, I don't believe the news media. They're all liars. And then my next question, where do you get your information from then? Fox News, blogs, Russia? Where do you get your information from? It's been one of those things that have been bothering me, because these are people I have a great deal of interaction with, and I just don't understand how they have such a radical departure to support a person that is so corrupt. It's just mind-boggling to me.
Well, it's the impact too of many of us old timers may remember the fairness doctrine when there was a limited number of television stations and outlets that the media outlet had an obligation to share both sides. So that's by the wayside, and the whole idea, the thought process was that if we have a number of partisan stations that aren't, abiding by what used to be known as the fairness doctrine, people will switch stations and still get a full picture of what's happening. Unfortunately, the reality has been, as you said, Nathaniel, there are certain people that only get their news from Fox News or from the internet, Facebook, and they may have a jaded view or inaccurate view of what's going on. So that's why it's just so important to have shows like this. It's so important for all of us, irrespective of our perspectives, to make sure that we're intaking media not only from the progressive points of view, but from conservatives' point of view and other points of view, so that we can be informed and we can inform others.
Attorney Bank, any closing comments today?
My comment would be that it's important to make your voting plan, make sure your families have a plan, also make sure you have a backup plan. Check your voter status today. Go to vote.org to do so. And if you can, vote early, if possible.
Even more important now, it's important to talk to these young people who have been disenchanted with voting and don't trust voting, to explain to them as clearly as we can that it is still very important right now, because this country could go backwards and it won't be a pretty picture. So
that sounds like a topic for next week.
Right. And I think the only thing too is that, we have to really just impart upon individuals that it's not only important in terms of voting at the top of the ticket regarding presidential races, but judicial races are so important. Zoning boards, this can have a very important impact on your life and your rights. So just stay informed, vote down the entire ticket. And so I think that will be something that will protect all of us now and in the future.
Excellent
all,
point.
all the folks here in Indianapolis, come join us on Tuesday. Me and my family, we're going to do early voting. It's just a tradition in the Lee family. We're going to go to the city county building and cast our vote. And on the ticket, of course, is our coroner, Afra Ballou. I called her and said that we'll vote first thing on Tuesday morning, so you'll be elected, because she's running unopposed, jokingly, of course. So thank you, everyone. We look forward to talking to you next weekend. Until then, check your voter registration today and go out and vote early. Call 10 folks and make them also aware of the fact they need to vote early. Thank you, everyone. Have a blessed day.